Senator Bernie Sanders scored a big endorsement earlier this week, and the Center for Popular Democracy Action, a coalition of more than 40 progressive groups, announced that they are backing the Vermont senator in the Democratic primary. It's the first time in the group's 7-year history that they've endorsed a presidential candidate.
That CPD endorsement is just the latest in a wave of support in the months following Sanders' heart attack. Last month, the nation's largest nurses union also threw their support behind him. Joining us now to discuss the senator's surge, his Medicare for All proposal, and more is Dave Sirota. He's a speechwriter and senior advisor for the Sanders campaign. Always great to see you in person, sir.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah,
appreciate it.
Talk about the significance of this CPD endorsement. Just tell people who don't know about this group who they are, what they represent, and why this matters.
So this is one of a number of endorsements that have happened, as you said, in the stretch run here. It's a group, an umbrella group of about 50 organizations of grassroots progressive groups across the country. It came after the big endorsement from the National Nurses United. We've gotten endorsements in Iowa of elected officials, of activists. I mean, we see more and more endorsements for Senator Sanders. I think what we're seeing is a crystallization of the race as we come down the stretch here, where groups aren't waiting on the sidelines anymore, and they see that the race is becoming it's coming into the stretch run, and Senator Sanders has been surging in the polls.
Do you see it as a two-person race? That's something we've been talking about here. It seems like Senator Sanders and Joe Biden are separating a bit from the pack.
Look, I think there's a lot of strong candidates in this race. I don't necessarily think that all of the candidates other than Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden aren't competitive. I do think, however, that if there's a contrast point in this race, there is a key set of contrast between Senator Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden on the major issues. And I think voters can see that contrast, that they can see, and it's been laid out in some of the debates, that Senator Sanders was on the right side of the Iraq War, Joe Biden was on the wrong side of the Iraq War. Senator Sanders was on the right side of the bankruptcy bill, working to try to protect Americans from the predatory lending institutions, Wall Street and the like. Joe Biden led the fight for that bill. And I could go on with a list of that, but I think the point that I'm making here is that I think that the race is coming down to a choice between those two visions, and voters are starting to see it that way.
I do wonder, though, Dave, why doesn't he say a lot more? I mean, he only does that maybe one time in the debate. He's done it twice in a row, but he doesn't take a lot of the opportunities on the stage to contrast himself. He treats much of these debates like a campaign rally instead of really trying to highlight. I mean, at this point, the differences between him, Elizabeth Warren, and Joe Biden could not be starker, especially on the issue of health care. I don't see him really talking about that as much.
But I would flip it back on you and say, if you see that the contrast is so clear, then the contrast is, in fact, being drawn.
Sure.
Right? And I think voters see the contrast as well. Let me give you an example. Health care, Medicare for All. The polls have continued to show Bernie Sanders as the most trusted voice on the health care issue. And I think what that says to us is that voters understand the contrast between a candidate who has never wavered on Medicare for All, so that I am not delaying Medicare for All. I'm pushing it in my first week as president, and that voters see that kind of profile, that kind of pledge, that kind of commitment versus the other candidates who, in many cases, haven't offered up that kind of commitment. And so the point is, I think the contrast is, in fact, coming through.
So the theory of the case for Senator Sanders is that he's going to bring in people who don't normally participate in elections. He has some history of that, in particular his time as mayor in Burlington. Do you believe that he'll be able to accomplish that? And do you think that the polls are underselling his level of support because of the number of outsiders he hopes to bring in?
That's a great question. And we have to understand that public polls are always based on, they always move around based on the methodology of the poll. And that sounds technical, but the point here is that the methodology is presuming what the electorate is going to be on election day. Now, the problem for those polls with a candidate like Senator Bernie Sanders is that Bernie Sanders' coalition includes a lot of first-time voters, voters who aren't necessarily counted among pollsters as likely voters, that is likely to turn out. And so the polls, depending on who does turn out, the polls are not, in the lead up to that, necessarily reflecting the electorate on election day. And as you said, Bernie Sanders has a long track record of bringing out voters to the polls who haven't necessarily been part of the political process in the past. And we see that, I mean, there was a big story in the Des Moines Register about the situation in Iowa and our ground game in Iowa, pulling out and reaching out not just to voters who are seen as, quote, likely Democratic voters, although we're reaching out to them as aggressively as possible, but also other voters, other groups that I think other candidates and other politicians have sometimes not tried to reach out to.
Could you talk about maybe some of the 2016 stats? What do we know about how many new voters Senator Sanders pulled into the process? Because I think you're absolutely right. This is the whole game. This was how Trump won the presidency. Outperformed his polls by 2%. Those 2% of Americans had never voted in the last three elections.
It's a story for Obama, too.
It's a story for Obama as well.
Absolutely.
And so if you want to be a change outsider candidate like Bernie, that's what you have to do. What do we know about his 2016 record?
So I'll give you two metrics.
Yeah.
One, Bernie Sanders received more votes from young people by projection, these are estimates, more votes from young people than either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump combined.
Wow.
So that was, and young voters are considered, in many cases by political operatives, not voters that you should focus on because they're not necessarily reliable to turn out. I don't think that's going to be the case this time around.
Right.
Another stat, in Iowa, we saw, I think it was 40 or 50% of the caucus in 2016 were first-time caucus goers. First time, that is, that they hadn't voted in a caucus or participated in a caucus before. So that's a huge upsurge.
Huge.
And we've seen in polls now, there was a recent poll that showed, I think it was a CNN poll, 30%, or it was the Des Moines Register poll, 30% of likely caucus goers, the folks who said they're going to go to the caucus, at least right now in their poll, 30% would be first-time caucus goers. My bet is that number goes even higher.
Very interesting. Wow. Now, I noticed in the New York Times article about the CPD endorsement, it was actually a positive article about Senator Sanders, very unusual in the New York Times.
A little bit unusual.
I saw Nate Silver actually making the case for how he's in a stronger position than he's been, also very unusual for Nate Silver. Do you think that the media is finally starting to sort of pay attention and wake up to the possibility that, look, like him or not, he is strongly in number 2 position behind Biden. He's in number 2 in most of the early states, or number 1. He's right in contention. Do you think that they're finally noticing that and waking up to that?
I think that folks are starting to notice that Bernie Sanders has a real shot. Now, I want to be clear. We have known that Bernie Sanders has a real shot to win this nomination and to defeat Donald Trump. But I think a lot of the national media has tried to, and maybe it's not necessarily deliberate, it's just, oh, there's all these other candidates, some of them are new, some of them are perceived to be, quote, serious frontrunners, and then there's this other guy over here, this senator who did amazingly well in 2016, but we're not necessarily think actually has a real shot to win. I think the revelation among that class, among the political classes, wow, Bernie Sanders really does have a serious and significant and real shot to win the nomination and win the presidency. And look, better late than never for that realization to happen.
Yeah, well, you know, one thing that forces them to cover you is when you win a primary or a caucus. So we're going to see. All right, Dave, great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Dave. Always great to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Next up on Rising, lobbyists can, of course, be some of the biggest influencers in politics today, convincing lawmakers to enact legislation that benefits their clients.
And now we know some of the top persuaders of 2019 are. Hill reporter Alex Gangatano. She discusses who are the Hill's top lobbyists, and that's next.